Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's geography webinar with Stephen and Sally. Please be aware this session is being recorded and the recording will be sent to you tomorrow along with any other material shared today. Please ensure that you have selected everyone as the recipient in the chat box and feel free to type questions as the session is running. Stephen and Sally will answer your questions as and when they can. Please ensure that your microphone is muted throughout the presentation until the Q&A session. Please note this event is not an official AQA event and therefore the views and messages shared are not representative of AQA. For more information about the specification and official events, please visit the AQA website. I must make you aware that you are not allowed to share the resources outside of your centre as this is a breach of terms and conditions set out by Hodder Education. Hope you enjoy the webinar today, and if you have any problems, please put them in the chat box. Thanks, and over to you both.
Well, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this feedback session on the AQA A-level Geography exams in 2023. We are limited to a 2-hour slot, so there's quite a lot to cover in a short time. However, we will consider all aspects of the assessment this year. We'll aim to give some advice for teachers and students preparing for future papers. And as you've heard, it's a double act today, so I'll do the first session. And then from 5 p.m, Sally will cover the second half. So this is the structure of the course. We'll start with a brief overview with the high and low performing questions, the overall performance in 2023, and then particularly on paper 1. And then the second session is focusing on fieldwork skills, trying to review approaches to fieldwork and how to prepare students for the exams, share some thoughts on the challenges of meeting the NEA element of A-level and the outcome of this series. And then after 5 o'clock, Sally will be looking at paper 2, exploring different question styles, the demands of various command words, and a chance to review how skills are being tested, including synoptic skills. And throughout this, we'll have a chance to look at responses to questions. There'll be a few marking exercises that you'll be able to do as well. And then finally, a review of the exam skills, particularly the higher demand questions, and how to access the upper levels of the mark schemes. So this is what we're aiming to achieve today. I think the key objective is to use the feedback to inform future exam performance and success. And it is essential, I'm sure you realise, to understand the style of questions that are linked to the assessment objectives. And then later we shall consider the requirements of the independent work and the submission of the written report. In this first session, therefore, we're considering the outcomes of paper 1, how it performed compared with previous years, some of the strengths and improvements, and where perhaps there were a few errors and misconceptions. Particularly focusing on 3 topics: water and carbon, coastal landscapes and hazards, because these are by far the most popular themes, although we will allude to some of the other topics as well. This is a brief reminder of the assessment structure. There are very few rubric offences these days. Students are becoming more familiar with the requirements, with the styles of question, the timing to be spent on each section as well. And I'm sure you're pretty familiar with what's assessed in each of the 3 components. The outcomes this year were remarkably similar to the 2019 exams. Paper 1 slightly up, paper 2 slightly down. Unit 3 was identical to 2019. And in fact, the awarding bodies were told to return more or less to the 2019 standards. You'll probably remember 2022 was a kind of halfway house between 2019 and the CAGs of 2020. So there's a lot of similarity between the results this year and those of 4 years ago. This just gives a very approximate idea of how many marks might be needed for each question so as to achieve a certain grade, although obviously students will achieve this in different ways. But for example, to achieve a sort of a grade C on a 20 marker, we'd expect the students to be getting something like 10, 11 marks, whereas to get an A star, they'd need to be performing very well, consistently across the paper, and perhaps getting up to sort of 17 or 18 marks on some of those 20 markers. Note the importance of spending more time on section C than the other sections on the A-level course. The higher mark tariff of section C is reflected there. So perhaps spend about 45 minutes on each of sections A and B. And then when you come to the non-core, the optional section, around about an hour should be spent on that. So the structure of paper 1 has a very similar pattern of questions and sub-questions, symmetrical within the core sections, starting with a short structured question and then a skills type of question, which is worth 6 marks, followed by an evaluative type 6 marker, and then finally the 20-mark question, the longer essay style. In a sense, there is intended to be a gradual incline of difficulty, but as you can see, half the marks for the paper are focused on those 3 longer essays. And then section C, slightly different. You still have that short answer question worth 4 marks, targeting AO1. That's then followed by the 6 marker, which is addressing AO3, followed by a 9 marker instead of 6 for the evaluative type question based on a source. And then there is a evaluative question, which is linking different parts of the specification content for 9 marks, followed by the longer essay. So obviously students would expect to spend a correspondingly larger amount of time on the optional component. These are the different types of questions. In every series, students have to attempt all those different question types. And you can see, just looking at that pattern of questions, how the assessment objectives vary between them. So for example, the 9 marker that I was talking about, which is testing links across spec topics, would have 4 marks for AO1, 5 marks for AO2. In the same way, the 20 marker would have 10 marks for each of AO1 and AO2. The only question that's targeting AO3 is the stimulus question, which is skills-based, and usually has the command analyze, which we'll come back to later on. So we're going to look at some of the different questions. Both Sally and myself will mention time and time again the assessment objectives. Just to remind you that AO1 is the geography, the geographical knowledge and understanding of particular concepts and processes and so on. AO2 is then applying this to make an argument or to evaluate, perhaps to make a judgment, linking together sometimes with a resource. It depends on the command word that's being used, but it is a step away from students being able to just memorize lots of detail and to regurgitate their learnt answers. And so they're applying what they know to a new resource, to a new example. In a sense, the student has to think on their feet. So it's quite a different approach. As we've said, the AO3 is the skills element, which appears on those 6-mark skills question. So it is important to grasp the significance of those assessment objectives and how they determine what is needed to answer each question. So we're able to reflect perhaps on the recent cohorts and think of ways to develop and to improve practice. There are some things that students are doing quite well. If we look at the average marks for each of the exam units, many are comfortably achieving level 3 and level 4 on the 9 and the 20-mark questions. Indeed, the chief examiner said that there are some outstanding answers in which students demonstrate a thorough grasp of geographical principles and an in-depth knowledge of place-specific case studies to support their argument. So there are many things which students are doing quite well. They're certainly getting this idea of answering the synoptic questions and making links between different parts of the spec content. But there are reasons why some students produce a more patchy exam performance, including those who are quite intelligent, those who have got a good grasp of geography. I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding of the command words, so the question is not being answered correctly. Sometimes the sources are ignored or referred to ambiguously. On occasions, the candidate makes general statements which are correct, but lack the necessary supporting evidence or case study material. And as we've seen, the ability to make synoptic links is crucial, where questions are designed to apply and evaluate ideas drawn from two different parts of the course. And so this business of making an evaluative comment and trying within the essays to have a discursive or critical tone, showing an awareness of different perspectives very often about an issue or an idea. Now, the raw statistics do show an increase in the entry overall, gradually gone up from sort of 13,000 in 2019, 14,500 candidates this year. The mean mark has improved a little. The threshold for each grade boundary has altered very slightly. And the A grade is nearly sort of 70%. So there is a wide range of marks. And you can see from this that there's a fairly consistent performance of the 20-mark questions. They vary from 11.1 average to 12.7, and very similar results across the different options. So no one particular route gives candidates an advantage over another. So what are the things that actually went well? I think there was a good spread of marks, little evidence of candidates running out of time. There was no dropping off of performance towards the end of the paper, and a good range of marks. So there were 11 marks between the grades, apart from the A star. I think most of the students also understood the value, the focus of the question. They allocated their times appropriately, and they were familiar with some of the specialist terms using appropriate geographical vocabulary. So good use of time management, and the majority of students, even the lower ability students, managed to sort of complete the paper, and there were sort of well-balanced questions attempted. It is important to stress that these optional units do perform comparably. There are minor differences on each comparable question, but no overall trends. You can see that across the various sub-questions, the percentages do vary. So within coasts, for example, the worst performing question was 49% on average, whereas the best performing question was 65%. And you can see a range for each of those other options or each of those other topics that are covered on the course. Synopticity is a recurring theme throughout, and where knowledge and understanding is just simply regurgitated without direct reference to the question, or where there are no links that are made, then marks are likely to stay in levels 1 and 2. So it is this ability to make those connections between those different units. This emphasizes the fact that the paper differentiated well, and where it was warranted, high marks were awarded. And we did see a very large number of candidates achieving, maximum marks, even on those 20 markers. And gone are the days where it was a proud thing for examiners to say, we never give full marks. In fact, with the mark scheme, these days, we encourage students or examiners, if they've marked or if the question is answered fully, that we don't hesitate to award maximum credit. And I think there is this increasing familiarity with the structure, with its requirements as time goes on. I think the structuring of essays was generally well done. Most included a kind of evaluative conclusion, or sometimes a set of mini conclusions and evaluative observations throughout. And it's gratifying to see how many candidates managed to cope with that style of synoptic questions, as we said before. Where we're unable to make an evaluation or to apply knowledge and understanding, in other words, if they don't address AO2, they can still get up to the top of level 2 on the 20 marker. So they could get 10 out of 20 without application, in theory, although that often doesn't happen. So these are all very positive points, recognizing the need for an evaluative focus, good structuring of answers, coming to a view, reaching a conclusion, or overall finding. However, there are some issues to consider where students didn't perform quite so well. So not responding to the precise demands, poor time management, sometimes a lack of detail in the use of examples, or very overgeneralized responses, which we might call the geography of anywhere, where they name a case study, but then the details could apply to any part of the world. Not making use of the source provided, and sometimes just focusing on those pre-learnt examples. I think this fifth point is crucial. It's not possible to regurgitate that learned material to use it indiscriminately. And so exam technique is vital, knowing the difference between the various styles of question, particularly those involving resource material. So these are some of the suggested improvements. And if you look at the booklet that we prepared, there are lots of examples of these different styles of questions and the various marks that will be allocated according to the quality of response. And certainly when students are presented with data, it's no good just doing a cut and paste. They need to manipulate it rather than simply describe, because that doesn't constitute analysis. Again, other improvements: deconstruct the questions and also respond to these evaluative commands, such as to what extent, the extent to which they agree or disagree with a statement, backing it up by specific evidence. Just a reminder of the mark schemes. Here we have a levels marked example, provides a descriptor of the requirements for each level, starting with the highest, indicating the trigger that's required to reach the higher level, and then providing some detailed indicative content or credit-worthy material. Although obviously, as professional geographers, the examiners would be able to credit other alternative responses which are equally credit-worthy. And so we use a best fit approach for defining the level and then use the variability of the level to help decide the mark within it. And so in levels marking, the mark is allocated for the overall quality of the answer as a whole and not for specific points within it. So let's think about these 4 markers. Knowledge is the key here, all AO1 marks. We aim for 4 clear points, more if you're unsure. They should be easy marks, although very few students manage to get 4 out of 4. They still must carefully decode and address all parts of the question, and they need to watch out for key terms or words such as not. Case studies and examples can also be credit-worthy in answering these sorts of questions. And so these knowledge questions are not necessarily the easiest or the best performing. However, you can see this year the scores were fairly consistent. Apart from ecosystems, the average mark was well over 2 out of 4. And they produced a broad range of responses. I think it depends on whether the student has understood the command term, if they've understood the course content. Very often it's a very precise definition which is required. Here's an example from the first part of the paper, question 1.1, outline the purpose of a flood hydrograph. And obviously that is distinct from what it shows. And I think a lot of students failed to extend their answer beyond just simply describing the hydrograph, talking about its various components and what it measures. The purpose might be to provide information for planners linked to river floods. It might be to help with flood analysis, with management strategies. And so that really was the focus of the question, rather than simply saying what a flood hydrograph looks like. So here's an example. This answer is focused on the purpose of the hydrograph. It doesn't stray into the construction. It doesn't stray into what the hydrograph actually shows. It's really focused on the question. Every part of that answer is credit-worthy, as you can see. However, if we look at the second script, the answer is largely irrelevant. It answers a different question. The first statement is okay, that's a suitable definition, but then the rest of it goes into, what causes a flashy hydrograph. All true, but not relevant in answering this particular question. Here's another example, question 3.1, outline processes of mass movement at the coastline. And here, some of the students managed to confuse this with longshore drift or processes of weathering or erosion. And I think the better answers were really focused by looking at 2 or 3 different processes maybe one that's slower than the other, different processes of mass movement. Here's an example which was given 4 marks. You can see that there's a developed point at the beginning, and then there's a definition or an explanation of landslides, followed by an explanation of rock falls. And so I'm sure all of you can see that that would be worthy of 4 marks. Again, it's engaging with the question very specifically. The second example, however, immediately drifts. If you'll exclude, just have a look at that. So you can see one example is longshore drift, use the pun, and then another type of mass movement is slumping. So it's only that last bit of the answer which is actually credit worthy. The rest of it is obviously a little bit confused. And then when we get to question 5, again, this is a 4-marker, outline the concept of mitigation. Here, the mean mark was just under 3. It was well understood, but a number of students drifted into adaptation rather than mitigation. And most of the better answers started with a definition. I think that's a general rule for all of these questions. And then they suggested different ways that it can occur, whether it be flood zone mapping or you can see the other possibilities there. So here's an example of one that gained 4 marks, a definition. You've then got some examples of ways in which mitigation of hazards can take place. So obviously this student really knew their stuff. The second example, an acceptable definition is given, but then it drifts a bit. But there is a vague statement which is just about credit worthy. Unfortunately, the end talks about adaptation, which was not part of the question. Now, let's think about the stimulus response questions, the 6 markers. So understanding the major command words, the 2 commands that we're most interested in are analyze and assess, because they're very commonly used in the stimulus response question. So to analyze something means to break down a resource or an idea, to look at it in a detailed and structured way. So we're looking to find connections between different elements, to manipulate the data, perhaps to convey an understanding of the source. However, to assess is to make an informed judgment about something using supporting evidence. And that means that the student has to apply knowledge and to apply understanding. And where a source is provided, it's important to use the information to develop the argument and to apply knowledge and understanding to what is shown in the material. So 2 very different styles of questions. And on the written papers, AO3 is largely tested through skills. It will always be linked to some kind of stimulus or resource. And so on each paper, this is going to be worth 18 marks. And it includes analysis, interpretation of geographical information. It can be qualitative, it can be quantitative, or both. It may consist of 2 or 3 different sources, but it does require engagement or interaction with an unfamiliar context, a previously unseen resource. And obviously the student doesn't have a great deal of time to deal with it, maybe 9 or 10 minutes to process the data, to understand it. The mark scheme states that the student should analyze the data or the evidence and must also make connections between different aspects of the data. And so they might be looking for links within a single resource or even across different sources. And the advice to students, I suppose, in tackling these questions, and certainly to teachers, is to embed them into your teaching, to select examples that pertain to each section of the course, because they need to engage effectively with any type of geographical information. It can be graphical, statistical, numerical, photographic, cartographic. All of those were seen in the series this year, paper 1 or paper 2. And a few tips to students on answering these questions. They should look very carefully at units, scales, axes, and keys. Go beyond description and lifting information. Try to make some overarching statements about trends and patterns, but also maybe to manipulate the data and to make use of it to support the main points. So what we're hoping to do here is to break the data down, to find some connections and to pick out some anomalies. And unfortunately, with the skills mark questions, the same issue does occur every year. It's the drift into reasons, impacts, or consequences, or causes. So in question 1.2, some candidates started to give reasons for the pattern of water abstraction, which wasn't answering the question. In 5.2, they were explaining why wildfires were increasing in severity. So this is really application of knowledge and not AO3 skills, which is what is being tested here. You'll see the variable response around about half marks, most successful in, I suppose, section C and also in question 1. In the landscapes, well, that tended to perform less well than other topics, but we'll see the reason for that in just a minute. Sometimes there are these multiple stimulus materials or lots of different bits of information, and candidates will score more marks where they're able to make links between these different pieces of information. And this skills question was answered quite successfully by many students. The resource did have some complexity, but it was handled quite well, and they had chances there to manipulate data. They could calculate the actual amounts used in different sectors, and that opportunity was taken by many students. Here's a response that was unfortunately very limited. You can sort of read it in your own time after today's webinar, but much was simply cut and paste. It was directly lifted from the source, in some cases just re-quoting the figure. So very little credit, as you can see from the description there, because it consists of direct lifts. However, this is a much better response, which actually scored 5 out of 6. It could have done a little more to analyze the data, but it's a good level 2 response with data manipulation to the fore, and it really understands what the source is saying, what the message is from that particular stimulus. Sometimes the question asks the candidate to look at the usefulness of a particular source, and this is where critical analysis was needed. And for example, in question 5.2, the student evaluating it, if they were doing it critically, would see that the resources really do very little to show that wildfires are increasing in intensity and severity. And so there is a need to practice the evaluation of resources and techniques. Now, I mentioned that some of the questions didn't perform quite so well. And if we look at the 3.2 or 2.2, 3.2 and 4.2, these statistical questions didn't score so well because some of the students found it difficult to work out standard deviation. And even where they managed to do that, they were unable to answer the second part, which was to evaluate the usefulness of the technique in analyzing the data. In other words, how it can help us to make inferences from the data set, or even what the potential limitations might be. And so many students failed to show understanding of the use of standard deviation. Many had access to the first 2 or 3 marks, but didn't score so well in the latter part of the answer. So that they need to look at the strengths, the limitation of those different skills. Here's an example, though, where the student did do very well. They got the first 3 marks, as you can see from that earlier slide. And here's the second 3 marks, which they picked up. There was a general awareness of the strengths of the technique, and there was an evaluative statement as well, so gave maximum marks. Unfortunately, the second response only managed to score credit on one aspect of the calculation. So they got the first mark, and then the rest of it was inaccurate. And so a kind of a knock-on effect of that is that the evaluation is likely to be poor as well. So they misunderstood the meaning of standard deviation. So achieving high marks on these questions, I think it is important to have that effective analysis of patterns, trends, and data, to apply active reading skills when they're looking at illustrations and other sources. Sometimes when they have statistical techniques, they can rush those. And it is essential to understand significance in order to interpret results sometimes and communicate what they mean. And with all of these questions, resist the temptation to explain the trends, the patterns, because the question is asking you to analyze the data. Now, the other type of resource question is one that has the command assess. So they're applying knowledge and understanding to a particular source. They need to use what they know and then apply it to the resource. It's a waste of time with these questions just analyzing the source in detail. Usually there's no need for data manipulation. Something new has to be brought in. And so the source becomes the springboard to answering the question. However, assessment is involved, so they have to make a judgment based on evidence. And obviously, there were lots of opportunities for students to demonstrate these skills. Over half the marks in the core. Note that COAST is again higher than the rest. It seemed to perform quite well in general this particular year. The options were less successful. And you'll notice in particular that the marks on these were well over half compared to the skills question, which we've just been dealing with. As we said, it's important to go beyond the source. There is no mark for simply analyzing the data. And with this particular question, which was about carbon sequestration, the main issue holding back the weaker responses that many thought it was an analyze the data type of question rather than application of knowledge. And for those responses, the challenges didn't come through. And I think quite a few people struggled with the concept, and so therefore they resorted to analysis instead. However, this particular question does show a good understanding of the concept. It applies knowledge and understanding to the source. It goes way beyond that simple analysis of data, starts to provide reasons for the changes observed within the graph. And indeed, in the second part, starts to give a good reason as to, or a good explanation as to why carbon sequestration has not increased as much as might have been expected. And it applies knowledge and understanding to the figure, as well as drawing on their own knowledge. This particular question required students to think on their feet. They can't simply interface with the data. And a very good example where many did this quite well was in question 5.3. They readily identified the fault lines, the rock types. Many students linked these to potential hazards associated with seismic activity. And then they considered sensible measures to do with evacuation planning, building reinforcements, and things like land use zoning. However, the less successful responses were those who just regurgitated the data without drawing on their own specification content. And they just simply recited knowledge without applying that, in some cases, to the context of the resource. But again, here's a good example of a successful response. Starts off by providing a general context about seismic hazards and mitigation, and then starts to refer to the figure, doing some sort of evaluation, interpretation of the material. And then in the latter part of the answer, goes on to the management techniques and refers to strengthening foundations, talking about retrofitting buildings with earthquake-proof infrastructure. And so that answer is relevant throughout. It might have been a bit more thorough on management. It was, shall we say, a little bit unbalanced. And so that's why it got 8 instead of 9 out of 9. But, a top quality answer nevertheless. The other type of question is the 9 marker, where there is no stimulus and where students are having to assess knowledge and understanding of links made across or within specification units. Now, the 2 questions in section C here considered links within the unit, whereas on paper 2, as Sally will refer, I'm sure, later on, the cross-specification question appeared there. So in question 5.4, they had to make that link between mud flows and Nuée Ardente. And as you can imagine, some candidates didn't know what was meant by that term, and so they were restricted in terms of the outcome. But I think a key point with these questions is understanding the required content of the spec, including the terms used. That's absolutely key to a successful response. And finally, if we go on to the essays, I think it was pleasing to see some very well-constructed essays. I think a typical structure is where students assert their own position in relation to the question at the outset. They then proceed to argue their points and then back that up with solid sort of subject knowledge, AO1. The conclusion then returns to the theme of the question and pulls together the previously argued points into one kind of closing paragraph. And with these questions, often there is a synoptic requirement, and the question setter makes those synoptic links very clear. These are the general descriptors. I'm sure you're pretty familiar with those: basic, partial, clear, detailed, and you can see the requirements for each one. These were the command words for this year's paper, usually a statement with an assessment of its validity. That can sometimes happen. But here the requirement was to evaluate or to respond to the command to what extent, or to assess the importance of. So you can see how analytical and evaluative skills, judgment skills are being required in answering those particular questions. All the average marks, in fact, were into level 3, as you can see from those statistics. And bar one example, they were all slightly better than those achieved in 2019. Here's a very good example of 1.4, evaluate the potential impact of changes in the carbon budget on a tropical rainforest that you've studied. And those who read the essay question carefully, they comfortably sort of accessed level 3 and 4. They considered how changes to the carbon budget affected a named tropical rainforest. The average mark was well into level 3. Let's just look at an example. This particular example actually got 20 marks. What we've done here is to just highlight where they've used the correct terminology: carbon budget. That appears throughout. They keep returning back to the question, and it's really comprehensive. It provides detailed knowledge about a case study. There's a real concentration on the impact of changes in the carbon budget. This second paragraph, very clear knowledge, some powerful support. Links are made, and there's application of understanding. There's evaluative comment throughout. And you can see from the brackets where the assessment objectives are being targeted. Again, this is making the link between deforestation to the carbon cycle and to net primary productivity, which is of great significance to the resilience of the Amazon ecosystem. And then finally, coming to the last bit and the conclusion, shows an understanding of negative, positive feedback mechanisms and their effects on the carbon budget. And there's a meaningful, quite an insightful conclusion. So this student's obviously understood the question, has included some support, some subject knowledge. They've understood the systems concept. They've looked at different aspects of the issue. There are detailed evaluative judgments. And so this would have no hesitation in being given sort of maximum level 4 marks, 20 out of 20. Obviously, not all students can produce that sort of level, but it might be a good sort of case study to use in class. And here's one that wasn't done quite so successfully, just to give you an example of a level 2 answer. I think the key limiting factor in 5.5 was those who didn't grasp the physical processes, the factors shaping their local scale location. I know that the examiners were fairly relaxed on what constituted local scale, but there did need to be engagement with the physical processes and factors. And a lot of students didn't really engage with this. They showed some awareness of human factors. And I suppose in a question like that, you can include reference to that in a kind of relative way, but the main focus should have been on the physical side. So here the student is referring to the ash cloud, doesn't really develop it very well, talks about the lava flow, identifies the severity of the eruption. So they are answering the question, but the development is quite limited. The support is very generalized. And so it very much fits into a kind of level 2 descriptor of being partially understood, partially evaluated, and was allocated 7 marks. At least they did manage to link to those physical factors, but maybe was rushing at the end, didn't have a chance to complete the work fully. So there's some general comments there about the next steps. I won't dwell on those now because I'm conscious of time moving on. But you can read these afterwards, just ensuring how students can improve their performance in future exams. So in the second session, we're going to focus on the independent investigation, the NEA, looking at some of the important steps that students can take towards maximizing their marks, boosting their chances of attaining top grades. And I think despite the additional challenges, the standard of work did remain very high. I'm sure you will have been sort of entering your students for submitting their work back in sort of April, May of this year. And it's always a tricky proposition, especially when you're working to deadlines with students and hoping that they submit the work on time. But the average mark for the NEA remains similar to that of 2019, about 40 out of 60. If anything, it was slightly higher. The vast majority of the work is marked accurately by schools. This year, under 15% of centres had marks that were adjusted by the moderator. So centres did manage to differentiate pretty well between students, and where it was appropriate to do so, they used the full spectrum of the mark range. Where the marking was a bit generous, it tended to be in area 3 or area 4. So that's the data presentation, analysis, or the evaluation and conclusion. Compared to last year, there was hardly any evidence at all of purely desk-based studies. I think nearly every student was able to get out and do some field work. There were certainly a lot more school-based studies and local investigations, probably because of the loss of those residential courses that are so popular. So there was some meaningful and detailed annotation on the CRFs taking place in most centres. The titles were developed by students. They were firmly rooted in the specification. Generally speaking, they were fit for purpose. And at the top end, there were some outstanding, imaginative, some insightful scripts, which reflected very well on the high quality of teaching and the hard work of the students. These are some of the areas of improvement, even since last year. Students being able to evaluate more effectively, not just limiting their comments to methodology, but actually taking a more holistic view towards evaluation. Their conclusions were valid. Some of the reports as well were a bit shorter, which sometimes increased their marks, ironically, because they tended to be more concise, but nevertheless very well expressed, and very often achieving maximum marks. And certainly there were hardly any malpractice issues, certainly none that came to our attention. These are some of the themes selected for investigation. I think there were a few centres that perhaps had a limited range of topics and titles. That may have been because of COVID restrictions, and obviously that limited the opportunity in some instances for truly independent work. There were a few students who tended to be overambitious. They were attempting tasks that were unmanageable, perhaps, or even unachievable, and maybe unfeasible in terms of scale. And in some cases, the concepts were inappropriate as well. But generally speaking, the themes selected for investigation showed a very wide range. You can see from this slide the proportion covering different parts of the specification. Changing places, yielding excellent investigative studies, by far the most popular selected by students, often linked with elements of contemporary urban environments. A large number of inquiries based on urban inequalities, with a substantial secondary data input on occasion. Rather less frequently, students tending to develop titles around local aspects of globalization or population, migration, and resource security. but we certainly saw different themes from every part of the course. So, as we've said, the marking was generally very accurate. It showed consistency, it showed accuracy. Most centres are using the recommended internal standardization procedure, supplying the expected evidence for this. This is obviously very helpful during the moderation process. It enables moderators to make a more informed assessment of progress. A couple of quotations from the lead moderator report. Firstly, the question of suitability of titles. Some were very brief, some lacked a theoretical or locational context, others that were entirely off beam, based entirely on secondary sources. They were a tiny minority, but they do crop up from time to time. And a few that were based on very broad and unmanageable titles. You can see a couple there on screen. An investigation of heat islands, or how the perception of place varies. I saw one that was called an investigation of biodiversity, another that was how management affects the coastline. So you've got no conceptual focus, you've got no evaluative question, there isn't a locational context either. And there were a couple that were just general topics. One that I saw on coral reefs in Belize, where there was no primary data at all. There is a second point, which is the tendency for many students to focus on the degree of success of a new development or perhaps a coastal defence scheme. And where they haven't got clear indications of success or impacts that aren't identified at the outset, it's very difficult to see how you can adjudicate on that degree of success. So these sorts of studies do require baseline data as well. A final point relates to the tendency for some students to focus on the degree of success of new development or coastal defence schemes. Clear indicators of success or impact should be identified at the outset, as we've said. So negatives, there were some examples of work where there was little evidence of either marking or annotation, and it's hard to see where credit is being awarded. In some instances, the teacher guidance on the CRF was a bit too specific. And conversely, there were cases where the title was simply approved without any written general advice or direction. And it is alarming to see some titles approved without any recommendations from the teacher at all. A few students just write at great length on aspects of the background of the study area, and that's got no bearing perhaps on the issue that's being investigated. So you get lots of indiscriminate copying, locational detail, historical summaries, almost a kind of Cook's tour guide. Some wrote a very extended or very poorly focused literature review, which is not targeted at the theme that's being studied. And just a few developed a series of sub-hypotheses or sub-questions that were not closely connected. So their investigations tended to become fragmented, lacking in continuity. And it is vital to have a single theme where the different parts that do sort of link together effectively. So here's a way in which the investigation should be structured. Obviously, it tends to follow the mark scheme. A lot of students tend to do this. They make sure that they're sort of looking at all four aspects or all four areas of the mark scheme. And in terms of the number of words, hard to be specific on this, but this would be the recommended number for each of the sections within a kind of broad parameters. You'll notice that slightly more marks are allocated, or more words allocated to area 3. And of course, that is represented in the greater proportion of marks awarded for that section as well. In terms of the CRF, remember that this is an ongoing workable document. It's a way of managing changes. And it may be important for a student to review this throughout the various stages within the route to inquiry. It is important to be flexible, particularly if the student has done various pilot studies. So the success of the NEA depends very much on careful planning, allowing students ownership of their work. They need to structure their investigations in a thoughtful manner and to have those appropriate sub-questions that are related to their investigation, because these drive the necessary data collection and they allow meaningful conclusions to be drawn. And you can see how the planning may take quite a considerable amount of time before they undertake their field work and writing up of it as well. Just getting on to the mark scheme and where things have either gone well or poorly this year. You're familiar with the 4 areas, the corresponding number of marks. As we said before, the methods of critical analysis, a third of the marks are allocated here, where the students are analysing, interpreting their data and applying their results to geographical theory. Altogether, 60 marks awarded on a best fit principle. We assume that each descriptor has similar emphasis. We're not in the business of counting techniques in order to achieve a particular level. The important thing is that the methods, the data presentation, the analysis are all appropriate to the study. So within those 4 areas of the mark scheme, you'll find 2 or 3 elements or strands in each one, and they all include 4 levels of achievement. And the overall level is a combination of those elements. Now, you might find that a student will perform at level 4 in one, level 2 in another, so their overall attainment is somewhere in level 3. So they might have a research question which is well structured, it has linked sub-hypotheses, it has comprehensive, good connection to the spec, so is level 4. However, the use of literature might be limited to 1 or 2 sources, not particularly focused. The theoretical rationale perhaps is inconsistent, so the overall outcome is somewhere in level 3. Now, this very small writing, I apologize for that, but what I've tried to do here is to link the mark scheme content with the requirements of the student, what they have to do, and then the key points that arise from that. So if you think in terms of defining the research question, which underpins the field investigation, what does a student have to do? They have to identify a suitable research question, one that can be investigated using field technique, and one that identifies the pertinent part of the spec and commented on that. The takeaway from that is that the 2 parts of the strand, the title, the research question, there are 2 different sections to that one strand. And when they are commenting on the link to the spec, in order for it to get to level 4, in other words, completely referenced, then you would include the relevant wording of the spec, as well as a rationale, a suitable comment, a justification to explain how it is relevant. Secure referencing might be that the wording of the spec is correct, but there's much more limited development, very limited comment or rationale in terms of the reason as to why that part of the spec is used. So for each of these key areas, what I've tried to do is to link the content to the requirements that the student has to reach and the key takeaway from that. Now, in terms of area 1, what are the things to watch? Make sure that the links to the specification are made. Beware of the multi-hypothesis approach, which can sometimes lead to lengthy reports with a great deal of repetition in terms of analysis and interpretation. Sometimes the sub-hypotheses not connected, so the investigation lacks continuity. Sometimes titles that are too broad or unmanageable in terms of the geographical scale. And likewise, there are things that the literature review has to do as well. They need to be linked to the investigation. The sources should be acknowledged. Avoid the cut and paste approach, which some students tend to follow. Don't have lots of irrelevant background description, which is using up those 4,000 guidance words. And sometimes students won't have theoretical context at all, or only cover it very superficially, and they ignore the locational and comparative context as well. So a great report shows understanding of the geographical theory that underpins the research. It refers to at least 3 different sources in the literature. It explains why the research is relevant, and provides maps at different scales to show the locational context. And here's some examples of questions. These all appear in the booklet afterwards, but they've got an evaluative focus, a theoretical element, a locational context. Most can be studied at a small scale. They're manageable, and you can see how they have a question that is open-ended that needs to be answered from field evidence. And so people will link the title to the specification in different ways. You can see the first example, the specification is just simply cut and paste, and some aspects are not relevant. Whereas the one on the right is one that the specification links are specific, additional comment is provided, and that's typical of the higher grade candidate. Similarly, notice the contrast here, a bibliography on the left just consisting of 3 sources, no specific page references, not linked to the written report. On the right, there is specific referencing, Harvard style with footnotes, a full bibliography at the end of the report as well. As we said, it's essential to provide a locational context. This one is very clear. There are maps at 4 different scales plus descriptions of the locations. Another one here which includes photographs as well. The literature review is designed to provide a theoretical context. It's essential to the rest of the study. Some students like to tabulate those sources, identifying their relevance to the hypotheses, the research questions, and then commenting on their value. And obviously, it's a good idea to have a range of sources so that you've got different perspectives on the issue. So I've done the same for key area 2, selecting, applying the appropriate methodology. Just briefly to say that strand 1 is all about justification, that things like sampling strategies, frequency, timing. Strand 2 is all about explaining how the methods took place and how replicable they were. And strand 3 is looking at whether those methods have been implemented and what's the quality, the quantity of the data that's been collected. And so you can see a number of key points to watch for each of those different sections, which I'd like you to have a look at later. And obviously, a great report will consist of a step-by-step description of the method that could be replicated by the reader. Gives you precise details of sample size, timings, frequencies, and above all, the data should be of good quality and sufficient in terms of sample size to be able to draw those meaningful conclusions. A lot of students use the methodology tables. I'll quickly flip through these because they just show a number of different ways of, justifying your methods. Key area 3, presenting, analyzing, interpreting data. Once again, there's a list of some of the key areas to watch in terms of the presentation techniques. So that's 3A, it's the quality of those techniques. 3B is the interpretation of results and how well they have explained their results. And the area which is not done particularly well is 3C, the link to the wider context, where the student needs to make a connection to the theoretical aspects, the underpinning theory, and avoidance of just seeing that data in isolation. And finally, just getting on to area 4, just before we finish. Again, there are 3 different aspects of this. So strand 1 is the overall presentation of the report, its sequence, its logical clarity, how coherent the work is, and all the different sources, presentation techniques that have been incorporated. Area 2 is about evaluation, and that includes, the validity of results, the conclusions, as well as the effectiveness of methodology. And area 3, the importance here of summarizing the main findings based on evidence and linking those back to the original ideas, the original hypothesis, and also to the theoretical background. Now, I appreciate that we've run out of time. If you look at the remaining slides, you will see how there are different key points to watch in area 4 of the mark scheme. a checklist that you can give to students, which tells them what they need to do in order to achieve maximum marks in their project, and a number of common pitfalls associated both with conclusions and evaluations. And you will see, if you look at the material in the post-event booklet, that there is an example of a piece of work that's been completed with a suitable commentary for each of those 4 areas of the mark scheme. It's not perfect by any means, but it's one that would have achieved, I think, a borderline A-B grade, and it does give you a fairly detailed commentary on some of the qualities of the work. So thank you very much for listening during this first part of the presentation. I think there'll be just a couple of minutes while we swap over, and then Sally will start on the second half in just a short while. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much to Steve for that really fantastic first hour with so many interesting things, both about paper 1 and general aspects of how the A-levels performed this year, but also some really super valuable tips about the NEA. So in this second hour, we're going to think about the human paper, paper 2, and we'll also try and draw out, I suppose from both papers really, some teaching ideas and kind of the big picture that we can draw from the results this summer, and thinking about how students need to improve and what we can do in the classroom to help them do that. So just a reminder of the units on paper 2, which I always like to start with, which I'm sure you're super familiar with, but often on these courses we do sometimes have people that have just moved from other specs, or sometimes non-specialists. Paper 2 has less optionality than paper 1. All students have to do sections A and B, so they have to do global systems and global governance, as well as changing places. Both those sections are worth 36 marks each. And then section C, the longer section that's worth 48 marks, is where the optionality comes. And in section C, you've obviously got the choice of contemporary urban environments, population in the environment, or resources. So I won't spend too long on this, as Steve went through the layout of the questions. And of course, it's the same on paper 2 as it is on paper 1. Sections A and B are laid out like this, and section C, the longer section, has those 9-mark questions in. But I think it's so important. One of the great gifts of this A-level is that the order of the questions remains the same, and those assessment objectives and how they're assessed need to be thoroughly understood by students. We're still seeing a few that are getting their 6 markers a little bit confused. So it's really important that they're dead familiar with this, and perhaps you display this in classrooms and certainly in the front of their folders. I'm going to skip through the grade boundaries that Steve's already talked about, but what I did want to just share with you, this is quite an interesting slide. I've tried to summarize here the mean marks for each question. I think, and as a teacher, I'm always fascinated by what options perform the best and what questions are perhaps less well understood by students. That's sometimes interesting as well, to see okay, well, we might not do that section, but why did that question perform less well? Because it can give us some useful information about what students find difficult, and therefore what we need to focus on in lessons, which might be a particular command word or data source and things like that. So here I've tried to color code the best scoring question for each different style of questions, and in green, and then the worst one in red. And it's interesting, you know, there isn't a particular option that does perform much better or worse than others, and it obviously fluctuates year on year. But, you know, it's interesting that those greens are spread in quite a lot of places, although changing places, looking at this, did not quite do as well this year, probably because of the triangular graph. But it's nice to see, I think, and to judge for your students whether they scored above the average, which can be quite pleasing as well. So lots of positives we can take from the paper. It seems as if most students now are really well aware of the particular demands of each question. This spec has been running quite a number of years now, and teachers are clearly doing a good job of training students in that exam technique. Some of the highest scoring students really produced well-written, longer answers, and the synoptic essay was particularly well done. There was also, I think, a bit of an improvement in the 6-mark skills questions, with more students being able to get into level 2, not necessarily scoring at the top of level 2, but being able to tip over into level 2 because they understood what they were being asked to do. But of course, the reason we're here, there's lots of areas for improvement, and there's similarities to some aspects of paper 1 in this respect. Too many students, I think, are lacking that knowledge of key terms that are listed in the spec. And instead of being able to give really specific case study facts confidently, sometimes the weaker students made those vague statements or sort of baseless comments that they couldn't back up with evidence. We'll have a look at some student examples shortly, student answers shortly, and we'll see that there's, the best students have a clear structure, and they can therefore really effectively pick up the marks because they just remain focused on the question and what it's asking. It is still frustrating that some students remain confused about the 2 different styles of 6-mark questions. And students need to realise as well that they're going to be thinking on their feet in this exam. They're not going to see a question that they've done before. They might see ones that are similar, but there will be a twist. There will be a link to something else. And so they must avoid just bringing in a response that they've learned from a previous practice question or a mock exam and thinking, oh, I've done this. They've got to read that question carefully. Okay, so we're going to dive straight in and have a look at each question in turn, starting with the 4-mark questions. The globalization question wasn't as straightforward as just tell me about global production and consumption. What are the patterns? It wanted the students to link those to the concept of globalization, and that's tricky for some students. A number of them saw the word globalization, which isn't really the thrust of the question. It's not the main bit, and then they defined that. But they didn't answer the question. They didn't answer what are the main patterns of global production and consumption. And as we often see on the human questions in particular, an easy way to pick up marks is to give examples of countries that either produce or consume products and examples of those products. So lots of students did pick up marks for those examples. The changing places question again had a link in it. Students had to choose a data source and then link it to people's lived experience. And again, here, reading the question carefully is vital because it asks for one data source. Therefore, if students list a number of data sources, they won't be able to pick up credit for those additional sources. Many students evaluated the usefulness of their data source, which is not what the question was asking. So it's really important they make sure that they're answering that question and not maybe a previous one that they've seen somewhere else. We'll have a look in a minute and have a go at marking a couple so you can see how some students might use data from their data source to pick up marks on that question. Moving on to the options, 3.1 did not score particularly well. And a few students tried to bring in the reasons that the service sector had grown rather than focusing on how that growth has impacted on cities. And actually, students that understood the question, it was relatively easy to pick up marks with fairly simple statements, bringing in ideas about workers coming into the city or students being attracted into cities for universities, about the change in land use from industrial to shopping centres, new buildings and facilities being built, and even some of the negative impacts of the service economy. In contrast, though, the population question was it was the best of the 4 markers. And perhaps that's because it was a slightly more straightforward question. If students understood salinisation, they often were then able to score very highly. The resources question was a little bit more challenging about resource frontiers, but some of the best students were able to bring in good examples, and that helped them to pick up credit here. Okay, we're going to have a go at a quick marking exercise now, just because I'd like you to see some good examples of 4-mark questions and the kind of comments that were picking up credit. And I think these are really useful to use in lessons with students and get them to mark them. And so they can see, well, which bits actually scored credit, which developed points were seen as good enough. So some of you will be listening to this on a recording and you might want to pause me for a minute while you have a go at doing this. All these answers are in your pre-event booklet. I'm going to show a lot of them on the screen, but if it's easier and you have that in front of you, it will be probably better for you to have a go at marking them on paper. After tonight, I suspect tomorrow now, you will be sent, or even Monday possibly, you'll be sent the post-event booklet, and that has all the ticks on, the annotations, the marks, and some commentary for them. So you don't feel that you have to write down what everything got in terms of marks tonight. So you've perhaps been reading while I've been talking. I'm just going to shut up for a minute and a half, just so you can have a read through that and be thinking, where would I put those ticks? What mark would I give these two answers? Okay, I know for some of you that are here live, it's Friday night and your brain might be a little bit frazzled. So I'm just going to talk through what the answers were, but I wanted you to have a go at reading through and thinking yourself, where would you give the marks? So the first one got 3 marks. The bit at the beginning, although it's correct, wasn't felt to be answering the question. The definition of globalization didn't get any credit. But then it went on to pick up some of the marks. The idea is that industries are more footloose now, so they've got this greater choice of locations. It talks about call centres in India, got a mark for that, and then something about containerisation, which enables trade to happen over greater distances. Student B's answer, although shorter, and this is quite a good one to show your classes, because perhaps they might have given student A more marks. It's not necessarily the quantity of the writing. You can see it's nice, straightforward. It talks about production in LICs, explaining why, consumption in HICs, gives an example of where it's happening. It's just such a straightforward, easy answer. This isn't a difficult thing. You just have to answer the questions. And there'll be a lot of students that will kick themselves that they didn't write such a kind of straightforward answer as that. Just going to have a look quickly at 2 more, and I'll give you a minute to have a read through them. This is from the changing places question, thinking about one data source and how it can be used to investigate lived experience. So I'll just stop talking for a moment to let you just quickly read those 2. Okay, so we have a look at the answers for these. The other way around this time, the first one got 4 marks here. It's a good answer. Got some, there's definitely some understanding shown of lived experience that got credit, some information about a data source that they'd used. Student D was wishy-washy at the beginning, really, a bit listy, not really having read the question, but then got into the answer a little bit, perhaps started off, panicked, stopped, and then reread the question and began again. So was able to pick up 3 marks for some information about this particular poem as a data source. Okay, So we're going to have a look at the 6-mark skills questions. And as I said, it seems as if students are scoring more highly and they've got a bit more of an idea how to get in level 2. But some of the marks on particular questions felt a bit lower this year overall, possibly because, as we'll see, one of the questions perhaps wasn't quite as some students and even teachers expected. It's really good that we're seeing less and less students trying to give reasons in these answers, because that was often a common problem, that students would try and explain the patterns, explain the relationships. And of course, there's no marks for that because these questions are pure AO3. It's just skills questions. And it was really apparent that students weren't expecting to be asked to complete a graph. We know commonly these questions just say analyze the figure or analyze the figures, but we do know that any skill can be tested on the paper, any skill that's listed in the spec. And in the past, there has been statistical tests on occasion, interquartile range, those kinds of things. There's been a couple over the years, although they have been few and far between. So we do always need to be alert to the fact that any of the skills could pop up on the exam. Triangular graphs certainly caught some students out, but on the other questions generally, we're seeing that students are able to see those patterns, identify anomalies, and manipulate data quite confidently. These are really complex questions, and students need to be aware that they've got to be selective with the data. It can feel quite intimidating. I know you might be the same, that when you have a look at some of the figures and you think, my goodness, like where even would you start? It's often quite funny how complicated they are, but that is part of the skill. The part of the skill is selecting the bits that are relevant, the bits that are useful. And there's no way in 6 minutes you're expected to deal with all the data. You could spend all day on it. So part of that skill is knowing, okay, well, how can I pick out the overall trends? And we saw this summer, there were just basic errors often, not reading from graphs accurately, confusion with scales, confusions with what the axes were showing. And I guess a lot of that is that students are really pressed for time on these questions. But some of it perhaps is we're not spending enough time as part of revision going back over skills questions and making sure that they're able to really decipher what complex graphs are showing. Sometimes we assume, well, you can see what the axis says. What's the problem? But spending those times in lessons, I think, it's really important students take their time and make sure they fully understand what it is that they're looking at. So 1.2 is definitely an example of a question where students found that the data was challenging to get to grips with. A good place to start when analysing is to look at what the big picture is and then start to find some figures to manipulate, back up that pattern or trend. We'll have a look a little bit later at some things we can do in the classroom. As I said, the triangular graph on changing places was difficult for some, not just in completing the graph that got 2 marks, but then in actually analysing what the data in the graph was showing. So if a triangular graph was a mystery, they were going to find it really hard, I suppose, to pick up any of the marks, just because they couldn't understand what the other points and their position, what that meant. However, these questions where they're completing something are marked slightly differently. They're marked as point-marked questions, as previous questions have been, and we'll have a look at a student answer in a moment. So actually, if they can access and do understand a bit about triangular graphs, it was almost easier to pick up the marks with it being point-marked than the level-marked analysis questions. In complete contrast, the scatter graph question was probably the best scoring skills question, perhaps because students are just more familiar with this presentation technique. It's more straightforward maybe. And many students showed they were confident in identifying the main trends and anomalies. They could manipulate data, even though the scales there were a bit more challenging. They could read things off and manipulate them to say how much bigger something was, and showing that they could make those clear links much more easily in this question. The population skills question was generally done quite well as well, although students must guard against taking each figure individually and describing what they show. And there was a little bit of that, sort of taking it map by map. And they've got to keep the focus on making those links between the different things they've been given, in this case, the different maps. Train them, if you can, to look for things like, what is the relationship? What is the same and what is different between the different data sets? And finally, the resources question. To get the marks here, they really had to look for those overall patterns, whereas the weaker students just sort of selected some bits of data seemingly at random. So we'll have a look at a few examples of some student answers. And again, these are all in your pre-event booklet. And if you're listening to the recording, you might want to pause me. I'm not going to get you to mark them, those of you that are here live, because it's really tricky to do that without the figures in front of you, which you may or may not have to hand. But I wanted to show you an example here of a student that's making some points. And as you read through it, you can be thinking, are they identifying the overall pattern and the anomalies? Are they linking that data together? Are they supporting it with some data manipulation? And it's a good one to show to students, perhaps, because basically the answer to this one is no, they're not really doing that. It stayed in level 1 and it got top level 1 3 marks. It sort of addressed the data quite separately. They weren't making confident links between and again, you've got to guard against that tendency that this student sort of lurches into to start giving reasons. I wanted just to show you part of the answer for 2.2. I've not included the triangular graph itself, and this student did pick up both marks on the triangular graph, but it's quite interesting to see where they were awarded marks. Of course, it's point marks, as I've just mentioned, so the credit-worthy statements are ticked. And this answer this student had been able to look and identify some patterns, see some of those groupings that was evident in the data, which was in itself quite tricky. I've actually, after this summer, I've just used this question in a mock with Year 13, and they actually did much better on this question than on some of the other sections, just because I think if you know what a triangular graph is, and I made sure that they did, then it's quite straightforward to pick up those marks. But of course, in the summer, many students really did struggle with this skill. And just finally, I wanted to give you a really good answer that you'd be able to use with your classes. This one is from Contemporary Urban Environments, but it's worth just, don't feel if you don't do that option that you can't use these questions. The great thing about the skills questions is that because there's no knowledge or understanding needed, you can practice with your students all the skills questions from all the options and the different sections you might not do. Because they should just be able to analyze the data no matter what it is. They're not having to give reasons. And here we can see that student G got full marks. It was a really nice answer. It made links all the way through, identified anomalies, there's data manipulation. It's a really confident answer to that question. Okay, so the second type of 6-mark question also has a stimulus with a resource attached, but this time it has AO1 and AO2 marks. So it's really important that students don't analyse, but they apply their knowledge to the figure, and that they also demonstrate their own knowledge and understanding to get those AO1 marks. When questions say use the figure and your own knowledge, it's really important they use the figure and their own knowledge. And unfortunately, some students do lose out because they do one, but not the other. And again, a whole range of different resources in these kind of questions might be used. Apologies. And students need to be really confident that if they're given text or photos or maps and different kind of resources, that they're comfortable with those different things. Now, on the section C options, there isn't a 6-mark question of this type, but the 9-mark question almost always has a stimulus, so we can treat them very similarly. Obviously, the 9 markers require a bit more writing. So on 1.3, I was looking at how global systems may cause injustices, and the resource gave some information about TNCs. Students tended to answer this really well. I think it's a straightforward topic. They understand TNCs generally, and they were able not only to engage with the figure and understand what the figure was showing, but use that to link to their own knowledge and then bring in their own knowledge of both injustices that TNCs might have caused, but also benefits that TNCs might bring to a place. The changing places question gave resources that were based around the Albert Docks, and students needed to engage with them to think about how past processes had influenced present-day place meanings. So a little bit tricky, but also such a great opportunity for students to bring in some information about how a place that they had studied had also changed, as well as engaging with the figure. And lots of students actually picked up their AO1 marks quite easily, which was great. I've got 2 answers here. One of them is for 1.3 and one is for 2.3 that we'll just have a quick read through. Now, I appreciate that you haven't got the mark scheme necessarily next to you, although you might have if you're listening to the recording, in which case please have a go at marking it. But first thing to sort of think about, if I was marking these for my students, I would be looking out, have they used the figure and have they used their own knowledge? And then thinking, well, are the statements they're making basic or is it clear? Can it get into level 2? So I'm not going to give us tons of time on this, but you can see at a glance, hopefully, a few things there. And if I just show you before we look at the marks in contrast, 2.3 that's here, you know, even at a glance, can you pick out them mentioning the figures? It looks as if they're bringing in some of their own knowledge at the bottom. And actually, they're both really good answers and ones that you could give to your students and say, can you highlight where they are, where the AO2 marks are, and can you highlight the AO1 marks? So for student H here, thinking about the TNCs and the resource on Vietnam, you can see I've tried to use green for the AO2 and red for the AO1. And it's not perfect. There's bits of overlap between some of them, but you're seeing that they've got that kind of knowledge that they're bringing in about Coca-Cola and about the price of chocolate bars and how much farmers get. And then they're using that TNC. And in fact, they use it at the end as well, quite well. So this one got 5 marks, mid-level 2, and student I got 6 marks. You could have seen at the glance, hopefully, that they were definitely interacting with the figure and some really, really clear statements they're making that show that they understand it. I suppose the only difference here between the two, both AO1 and AO2 here is really detailed, and for the student before, student H, they could perhaps have done just with a little bit more AO2, but it was they were both really good answers. So, of course, the 9-mark questions are longer answers, but when a figure's used, that same principle applies of being able to link their own knowledge to the figure, to apply their knowledge and understanding to the figure. And the figure is like a sort of trigger, like a springboard into their own knowledge. The command word is sometimes slightly trickier for the 9-mark questions, and they're more likely to be based around evaluating or assessing the extent of something. So here on 3.3, they had to use the information on Mexico City and bring in their own knowledge. But they also had to evaluate the success of those urban pollution reduction policies. And there was a range of interesting examples that were used in these answers. The population question was done well by most students, and they were able to use both the resource and develop their answers to make the links from the resource. The resource didn't mention health, and then they had to make that link into looking at the challenges and linking it to health, and both physical and mental health. We'll have a look at an example of that in a second. And finally, on 5.3, students seemingly were well able to make sense of the resource and apply their own knowledge to it. And I'll show you an example of this too in a moment. So we'll have just a quick look at these two, and I really kind of just want you to think which of these two answers you think is better, and we'll have a look at why. So remember, on these questions, we're looking for the use of the figure and their own knowledge that they're bringing in. So if you've got it in your booklet, that's easy. If not, I'll move it on to the next slide in a minute. Let me just shut up for 30 seconds so you can quickly scan this, and then we'll have a look at to see which one was better. So this is student J. And then student K is here. Okay, really just wanted to give you a little bit of time to scan through and see what you thought. So when we have a look at the two, J was the best one, and actually was a really good answer. It got mid-level 3. It was really detailed, 8 marks. Again, I've tried here to highlight in green the use of the figure, and then the red bits are where they then linked that to what they've learned about the impacts this would have on health, which is quite nice. I think a tiny bit more of that, and it would definitely have been a full marks. K has some issues. The main one being, as I'm sure you spotted, that it really didn't make any good use of the figure. Here's an example of a student that thought, right, I know about this. Here's my case study. Let's go. And had clearly learned lots of facts about this particular mine, but didn't really engage with the figure. Started to a little bit towards the end, but there really wasn't much clarity in that part. So overall, it was felt it was bottom level 2, and this one got 4 marks. So again, it's quite useful to show students, I think, that we want to avoid a case study dump of just, here's everything, I've learned this, you will listen to what I've just learned. I'm going to tell you all the things I've learned. That's wonderful as that might be, actually, it doesn't necessarily give you lots of marks. And on a 9-mark question, remember there's 4 marks for AO1 and 5 for AO2. So those AO2 marks really are essential. Okay, the second type of the 9-mark questions doesn't have a stimulus, and it's similar in style often to the 20-mark questions. Sometimes this has been a commonplace, as Steve was talking about, for the cross-unit synoptic questions. In the past, we've had them on these human 9-markers here, but this year the 9-mark questions had synoptic links within units, and these can often be quite tricky to answer as well. You might sort of prepare students for, there will be a cross-unit question, which comes on question 1.4 on the globalization essay, but it's these other synoptic things when you read them and you think, what? Why have you linked those things together? And that's the synoptic sort of surprise bit of linking different bits of the unit together that you perhaps wouldn't often do, and practicing those is in lessons is important. Sometimes students get really confused by them. So not only do they need to demonstrate that they can respond to the command word in this question, for the AO2 marks and demonstrate their knowledge for AO1 marks, they also have got to address the link that's in the question. Again, a really useful technique is to get students checking back to the question and ticking off each part as they cover them. And then if the worst happens and they just cannot get their brains around or find a way around making that link, then they need to answer the bits of the question that do make sense to them. And they will at least pick up some marks rather than just assuming, oh, I've not been taught this, I don't know what it is, and leaving it blank. We want to avoid that. Generally, 3.4 was done quite well, and students were able to engage with the question. They were able to deal with the synoptic link from waste management to economic characteristics fairly well. Quite a few different case studies were seen in this answer, and they were often used quite well to demonstrate that the student had learnt knowledge about waste recycling schemes that they could apply to the question. The population question posed a bit more difficulty for some students who struggled with some of the words in the question, and in fact some wrote about infectious diseases rather than non-communicable ones. But this is an example of, even if the student is a bit confused by the synoptic bit, they're able to pick up the marks by addressing certain parts of the question. 5.4 had some good answers where students were able to be selective in providing evidence for the points they're making, but some of the weaker students just basically wrote lots of things they remembered from their example, and sometimes there was quite a weak focus on what the question was actually looking for. So we'll have a look together at a couple of examples, both of them for 3.4, so you can easily see how they contrast. So student L, as you can see here, was a relatively low scoring answer. The AO2 here in green is quite tentative, it's quite basic. And the AO2 demonstrates that there is some knowledge of an example, but the question does ask for 2 examples, and that limits the marks that were given here. Almost feels a little bit like a GCSE answer, this one, doesn't it? It's not really very well developed. In contrast, student M really went for it and wrote a really detailed response, demonstrating strong knowledge throughout, comparing the approach in 2 places. You can see the AO2 is especially strong here in green, really trying to link to economic characteristics. There's some good discussion. The conclusion is a tiny bit short, and a bit of a better conclusion would have given it full marks, but it scored 8, level 3. Okay, we're going to think about the 20-mark questions, which are clearly an area that students are well practiced in, and many can structure their answers extremely effectively to answer both AO1 and AO2 marks. However, if students aren't confident in those key terms in the question, or they've not thoroughly learnt their case studies, they're going to have problems picking up the marks. The best answers have an argument that drives the response throughout. This is then backed up with the AO1 knowledge, but it's that argument that's to the forefront rather than an answer that tells you lots about a particular case study and then tries at the end to tie it back to the question. That's kind of like the wrong way around. It needs to be the argument first. And for the highest marks, a really good conclusion is essential. The conclusion ought to be a summary of the main arguments of the answer that thoroughly links back to the question. We'll have a quick look at how to write conclusions shortly. So the synoptic question was really well answered by most students, and it was clear students had learned their Antarctica case study thoroughly, although there's still 1 or 2 that believe that polar bears exist there. They were well able to bring in lots of knowledge and understanding about the threats like climate change, fishing and whaling, the impact of tourists on that fragile environment, and the potential of resource exploitation. They weren't fazed at all by the synoptic link, and they were able to bring in some knowledge from the water and carbon topic on the physical paper. The changing places question asked students to focus on either economic change or cultural characteristics, and most students did clearly select one, with very few trying to talk about both. There often is quite a noticeable difference between answers that's based around some textbook case studies and where students often lack a real depth of knowledge about a place, especially if it's one they've never visited, because of course some are just too distant. Because to score highly, it's important students don't make broad sweeping statements about places. particularly if they're quite large places. They need to really show that they understand there are complexities and nuances in places. And it's good to keep, I know it's time consuming, goodness, it really is, but it's good to try and keep updating place knowledge, particularly if it's their local place. Generally, though, students did seem to understand what the question was asking. The contemporary urban environments question produced some responses where students were very much determined to go into some detail about economic inequality and the history of the place, a lot of background, without really focusing on whether those patterns were caused by human and physical factors. Or should I say whether human and physical factors were more important in creating those patterns of economic inequality? Is it human or is it physical? And some students did find this really tricky and could only suggest some very basic physical and human factors. It's worth taking into account as well, the examiner's report said this, that if students are asked to contrast and their two places are incredibly different, a large city and a tiny small village, it can be really difficult to draw meaningful comparisons. So that's just something to be aware of. The population and environment question was another opportunity for students to bring in some really good case studies. And there were some excellent local examples used. Some of the weaker students, though, did tend to make really simple statements, and that just showed, I suppose, a lack of depth to their understanding and much more tentative comments. Finally, the resource question had a real range of answers, from some that were extremely evaluative and detailed. The case studies had been learned in tons of detail, to answers that were a bit more tentative again in evaluating the sustainable aspect of the question. Now, I've not included on the slides the examples of 20-mark questions because they're just so long, but I have put 2 in your booklet, blank in the pre-event and marked in the post-event booklet. And I wanted you to be able to use them with your students and take them away to have a look at. If you're listening to a recording of this and you want to have a go at marking them, then feel free. I will just say something about them now, so you might want to pause me if you are doing that. I was going to say that I've included an answer that got level 3, even though there's quite a few inaccuracies, there's some misunderstandings in some of the parts of the answer. There isn't negative marking. The examiners are looking for the good in the answer, and there was still felt to be enough clarity and lots of AO1 that was pretty good, that got it into level 3. And then I've given you an example of a 20 out of 20, which hopefully is one that you can share with your students. So for the last 15 minutes or so, we're just going to have a look at what lessons we can learn from the exams, particularly focusing on those areas that we know students need to improve on both papers, and thinking, well, what simple things can we try and do in the classroom to hopefully correct any misconceptions and boost those marks. I always spend quite a lot of time after the summer exams doing some analysis, and you can look online on the AQA results bit and see how your students performed. Well, each student individually, what marks they got, but as a cohort, whether they were scoring higher or lower than the mean scores for each question. And I find that really interesting to think about, well, which topics were tricky, but also what are my students struggling with? And we often seem to spend a long time in school practicing 20 markers, when in fact the data often suggests that marks are lost on the 4-mark questions. And if students could be more well prepared for these shorter, ideally, be getting 4 out of 4 on them all, those marks might really help. And we definitely see that it is about really learning that knowledge on these 4-mark questions, the key terms and the processes. Can they explain why these things happen and the order they happen in? Do they know examples? And on the human paper, having some specific case study facts often really is helpful in picking up those marks. And it just comes down to the cold, hard learning of facts. You might decide to start every lesson you teach with a 4-mark question, on the board when they come in, even if it's the same one done over and over again, until they can confidently all get those 4 marks. Tweak words, change the words slightly to prove that they have to keep reading those questions carefully and not assume it's the same as the one last lesson. Just use the spec and make loads and loads of 4-mark questions, or starting the lesson with getting them to write down 5 facts about a case study. Or 5 points about a process. I often choose 5 for these things because they won't remember 5 in the real exam, but it's good to aim high. So these are all just different ways of making sure that they can pick up the most marks. When you're going through the spec and you give them a key term or a process, would they be able to get 4 marks on it? Do they know how to develop their points? And it's really important that they can stay focused on that particular question and don't sort of go off on a tangent. So training them to keep going back and ticking off parts of the question to make sure they're on track is really, really important. You might give them, simple lists of key terms from the spec, all these kinds of things. It's making sure as well for some of these students, perhaps less so for this cohort than last year's cohort, which had not done their GCSEs, making sure they've got those revision skills to be able to learn key terms and be able to remember case studies. Thinking about the skills questions, although usually, as we've seen, they mostly have been analyze the figure or analyze the figures, we do keep seeing these questions where students have to present something or calculate something. So it's really important that students know this can happen. And you might teach all these skills when you're doing NEA preparation or when you've done fieldwork, but doing them again before the exams, revising them, is important. I talked before about the need to be selective with the information. There's no way in 6 minutes you can deal with so much complex data. So I train my students always, before they do anything at all, read the title, read the key, so they know what they're looking at, because you can get drawn into these multicolored diagrams and things and think, what on earth is this? If they read that first, they should know immediately what they're looking at. But they can annotate, stress to them, they can draw on the figure, they can put ruler lines on so they can read off, they can put circles around the things that they want to talk about, they can scribble on it, because the more they interact with the figure, the better they're going to be able to understand what it's showing, and they've got kind of reminder of what bits they want to talk about. And a reminder to practice them from any of the option sections, because it's about the skill rather than the knowledge. So these are listed in the spec, some of the types of skills and data sets that students need to feel confident with. We often have students still that when they see information that talks about wards, thinks it means hospital wards rather than census data wards and council wards. So it's those little things, making sure that they're comfortable with what it is that they're looking at. And then again, just really quickly from the spec, a bit brightly coloured, but this is cut and pasted, all the different skills they could be tested on. All these things could appear at any time on these questions. Obviously, we've seen triangular graphs, we've had a few of the stats, but it's making sure that they're prepared for any of these things. I try and train my students to use the acronym PALM because it reminds them, look for patterns. That's the first thing. Look for anomalies. Make sure that there are these links between the data sets, linking all the time, and manipulate the data. That's what they need to do to get into level 2. They don't have to do it in that order necessarily, but when I mark their answers, I will write the letters of PALM down the side in the margin, and then they can see, are there any that I've missed out, or is there any perhaps I only did once? Is that letting me down? But the big thing is that they're linking together. So they're saying, okay, in this data set, this is high. Is it also high in this other data set? What is the relationship? As something increases here, does it increase there, or does it decrease? And then what are some anomalies? Can I manipulate the data? And by that, what I mean is doing a simple sum. Something has doubled, something is twice as big as something else. They've got a calculator with them. So they ought to be able to, it's not just reading off, they need to be able to do something with it. So if you have any students that are still struggling to make the links between, and what I've done in the past is print out the figures and get them to fill in either in boxes or to fill in, just draw lines between the figures. But the idea is it's showing them they've got to link the figures together. This one had 3 different figures, which doesn't often happen, but making sure that they know. And these kind of exercises, if they've done stuff like this on a piece of paper, it's sowing that seed in their brain of the technique of how to do it in the exam. So on the stimulus questions, students really need to avoid writing answers that just focus on their knowledge without engaging with that stimulus. They must use that figure as a trigger into their own knowledge, and then they can apply their knowledge to it. But it's still worth remembering that those AO2 marks are slightly dominant. And very similar, I've developed this technique for training students, again, that they must use the figure, but they also must demonstrate their own knowledge and understanding. So if you've got the time, you can cut and paste the figure into the middle of the boxes, and then one of the boxes, first one, as the AO2 kind of drives it, they're just going to bullet point their plan in there, the things in the figure they want to talk about. And then the second box, they can bullet point what things they're going to bring in from their examples or their case studies or their knowledge to demonstrate that. It really doesn't even have to be as fancy as this. You could just print out the figure and get them to write around it in 2 different coloured pens, one for their own knowledge and one for what they're picking out of the figure. But it's having those little things, so when they're sitting in the exam, they remember, oh, I know what I need to do because I've practiced this loads in class. And just a couple of tips really on the longer, more extended answers. We've seen from some of the examples tonight, students really need to try and avoid making baseless statements. If they're saying something, they need to back it up with some solid knowledge from their case studies, and that's what's going to help them score highly and get in those level 3 detailed marks on these 9-mark questions. The question might not specifically ask for an example, but they should be expecting to write about a place or places they've studied and to give specific facts about that place, not the geography of anywhere. Some students have this real tendency to write very lengthy answers, but once they're past the space given on the paper, it just often is waffle. So it's important they check back all the time that they are in fact still answering the question and not just trying to show off the knowledge they've revised, which might not be relevant to the question. I train my students, particularly at the start of year 12, to use Pedal to help them structure their answers. And I really like it because it forces them, by the nature of it, they're going to pick up both their AO1 and their AO2 marks. And if they run out of time partway through, they've still been hitting both of those AOs all the way through. So the idea is they set out their argument to begin with. That's going to drive the answer. They're making their point, the point they're going to argue, and that's the AO2. Then they're going to support their point with some evidence, with case study facts and examples. That's the AO1 knowledge. And then they're going to bring in their AO1 understanding by developing those points. So this means that, a problem of this would be, those kinds of statements. And then finally, they link back to the question, which might be showing how something links to something else, or an evaluative comment, if it's to what extent question. So therefore, I agree to a large extent that blah, blah, blah. And if they do this every paragraph, it's just a really effective way of picking up the marks. And, you know, again, Pedal can be used really well on 20-mark questions to make sure they're getting that balance between the AOs. One of the big issues students, I think, face with 20-mark questions is the question can be so very wordy and long. And it's vital that students take the time to unpick the question, figure out what is actually being asked, if necessary, rewrite bits of it, or add in their case study place names into the question so it feels as if it makes a bit more sense, and keep going back and ticking off the bits they've done, checking that they're still on track. They should be easily able to pick up the marks in the space given. There's no real reason to write on lots of extra pages. If what they're saying is focused on the question, they'll have picked up those marks quite efficiently. And the cross-unit synoptic questions this year were not badly done at all, but some years students have struggled, and this year I think, as I've said, some of the harder questions tested synopticity not across the units but within units. So it's important that they understand that those kinds of questions might pop up, and sometimes, as we saw, we certainly had a question last year on paper 1 that did this, that links to something that isn't on the spec at all. So it's important students understand this isn't something to trick them. This isn't that you haven't taught them well, because you definitely have. This is synopticity, and it's about thinking on your feet. It's linking to things, because geography isn't in real life these neat little topic areas. Things are interconnected, they're complex. And so I suppose we have to build up a resilience in our students, being able to tackle those tricky questions and give them the skills of being able to unpick them and address each part of them through practicing these difficult ones in class, and making sure on mock exams you're giving them some synoptic questions. Just as we come to the end, I'm trying to say something quickly about some command words, because I think this is really important in helping students decode questions. Assess is probably, well, it is the most used command word now, but up there in red is what assess means according to the AQA website. I think that's quite difficult to understand, whereas when you look at some of these questions that are listed here, it's perhaps a little bit easier. So it's worth showing your students a list like this and saying, would you understand what each of these questions wants you to do? And I've highlighted the last 2 in red because they're asking something slightly different. The relative important questions, or the relative usefulness, this relative bit means something different. It's not that is something important. It's asking how important is that thing in relation to other things. So this argument here has to be kind of comparing. They're making a judgment whether something is the most important thing or is something else more important, which can open up to some really interesting counter arguments in those answers as well. So students need to be able to spot, oh, it's a relative importance question, and know how to deal with that. Sometimes students seem to struggle a bit with conclusions, and one of the great things, if they've used a pedal structure, is that they only have to look back at each paragraph to see the point they were making, and that those bits are what comes together to form the conclusion. So they obviously aren't rewriting all the evidence again, but the thrust of their argument from each paragraph, the bit they started off with, the point they were making, all those bits are summarized at the end. I always say to students, I should be able to read your conclusion and know exactly what you've argued throughout. The conclusion doesn't have any new information. It's based on what has already been written. And a really good revision activity actually is just to write the conclusion to different exam questions. And sadly, often what stops a very intelligent and clearly well-prepared student from getting full marks will be their conclusion is a bit weak. It's almost as if they thought, well, I've told you everything I know, and their conclusion is just a sort of sentence. And they need to realise that in the 20-mark questions, especially, the conclusion is there as a chunk of the mark scheme, and therefore it needs to be detailed as well. Okay, almost bang on time, I think, by my watch. This brings us to the end for tonight. And I'd just like to say a massive thank you for either attending tonight or those of you that are listening to the recording. And I hope you found it useful. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sally. And thanks everyone for coming. And just a quick reminder that recording will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with any other materials and a link to a feedback survey. I have also just posted the survey link into the chat, and we would really appreciate if you could take your time to give us your feedback. Thanks for your time today, and hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.